Thanks. My name is David Haglund. I'm the managing editor of PEN America, which is the literary magazine published by PEN American Center, which is the largest branch of the oldest literary and human rights organization in the world. On behalf of the 3,400 writers, translators, editors, and other members of the literary community who belong to PEN, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event tonight, which is part of the 6th annual PEN World Voices Festival of International Literature. I quickly want to thank the festival's many sponsors and supporters, and tonight especially Galapagos Art Space for hosting us in this, I think, pretty incredible venue. I also want to thank the more than 100 volunteers who helped make the festival happen, several of whom are here tonight helping make tonight happen, so thank you. There are many, many more festival events over the next few days, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and I encourage you to attend as many as you can. There are some programs on the table in the back when you leave, but you can also find out everything you need to know on PEN's website, which is www.pen.org. This year, PEN celebrates the 50th anniversary of its campaigns on behalf of persecuted writers, and for 5 decades, PEN has been instrumental in freeing hundreds of writers imprisoned for their words. Today, PEN continues to fight for writers around the globe. To highlight this ongoing work, you'll notice an empty chair to my left at the end of the stage. This chair represents those artists around the world who have been robbed of their right to freedom of expression, who are prevented from practicing their craft openly or without fear of persecution, and who are unable to join us today. It is a reminder that the silencing of writers in one country robs the entire world of their voices. Happily, we do have some writers and editors here with us today who will share their voices. I'm just going to introduce them quickly. On my far right is Peter Stamm. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah,
Stamm. Peter lives in Switzerland. He is the author of the novels On a Day Like This and Unformed Landscape, of which The New Yorker said, if Albert Camus had lived in an age when people in remote Norwegian fishing villages had email, he might have written a novel like this. I don't know if you've heard that one before, but yeah, it's pretty good. He's also written short stories and radio plays, and for 5 years was on the editorial board of
about 5 years.
Of Literary Quarterly in Switzerland. Next over is Rodrigo Fresán. Rodrigo was born in Argentina and has lived for many years in Barcelona. He writes for many newspapers and magazines and is the author of 8 books. His novel, Kensington Gardens, was published in the United States in 2006 and was called A Brilliant, Maddening Phantasmagoria in the Washington Post. His newest novel, The Bottom of the Sky, was published in Spain last year. Rob Spillman, immediately to my right, is editor and co-founder of Tin House, an 11-year-old literary magazine based in both Portland, Oregon and Brooklyn, New York. Tin House has been honored in Best American Stories, Best American Essays, and numerous other anthologies, and was nominated for the 2010 Utne Independent Press Award for Best Writing. Rob's writing has appeared in Book Forum, GQ, Rolling Stone, and many other places. He is also the editor of Gods and Soldiers, the Penguin anthology of contemporary African writing, which was published last year. M. Mark, on my left, is the founding editor of PEN America, a journal for writers and readers, which I mentioned already. In 2000, the journal was named one of Library Journal's 10 best new magazines, and recent work from PEN America has been reprinted in Harper's, Best American Essays, and the Utne Reader. This year, the journal was nominated for an Utne Independent Press Award for international coverage. Previously, M founded the Village Voice Literary Supplement and served as its editor and publisher for 15 years. She has also edited several books and now teaches at Vassar. And the last panelist, John Freeman, is the editor of Granta, which was founded in 1889 as a student magazine at Cambridge University in England, and was reimagined in 1979 by the American editor Bill Buford, who helped turn it into one of the world's leading literary magazines. John joined the magazine in 2008 and became editor the following year. He's also an award-winning book critic who has written for the New York Times Book Review, the Los Angeles Times, People, the Wall Street Journal, and many, many other publications. His book, The Tyranny of Email, was published last year. So those are our participants. I thought I'd start very briefly by defining our terms and then trying to get an international perspective first on this issue. When we say literary magazine, we can mean many different things, but I think in this country, and feel free to disagree with me, but we generally mean magazines that look a little like the ones here on stage, Granta, Tin House, and PEN America, published maybe 4 times a year. They look like a paperback book. They have a lot of fiction and poetry. But I'm not sure that is how international a phenomenon that is. This sort of literary quarterly that has become kind of the dominant form, perhaps, of publishing literature in this country in periodical form. Perhaps that's changing, and certainly literary magazines themselves are changing thanks to the internet and everything else. And I want to suggest at the beginning, and again, people can disagree, that as the way that we publish literature changes, what we imagine literature to be may also change. And if that's the case, and if literature is published differently in different countries, does that mean we're thinking of literature differently in those other countries as well? So, Rodrigo, I thought I'd throw it to you first. You write for a number of magazines in multiple countries.
Yeah.
Would you say that the magazines in Spain, for instance, where you live, sort of fit the model that we're describing, the sort of Granta?
No, not at all. Well, there's Spanish Granta.
Right,
now,
yes.
but it's completely different, and it's completely different in Argentina. I was amazed. I've been to Sweden like 2 weeks ago, and then they invited me to the headquarters of a local literary magazine, and it was very surprised because I asked them since when you've been publishing the magazine, and they told me 160 years. I said, wow. I mean, that would be, I mean, the last great literary magazine in Argentina probably it's Sur, where it was published by Victoria Ocampo and Silvino Ocampo and Jorge Luis Borges and Adolfo Bioy Casares. It was that circle. When I started writing, in fact, there weren't any literary magazines. I mean, the things that most resembled a literary magazine, paradoxically, were the credit cards monthly magazines, sponsored by credit cards, where, I mean, you knew that you had like almost completely free reign, you know, living under, for example, a dictatorship. And you could sort of, I mean, there were things that, of course, you couldn't write about, but you would be able to do things in that context, because credit card magazine from an American credit card was not suspicious in a way. You know, it was like a Troy horse, you know. They weren't, I mean, censors and military people weren't reading credit card magazines looking for subversive elements, you know. So it was more, now I think there are more literary magazines, but there are like, I don't know, paraphrasing Paul Simon in The Boy in the Bubble. I think that, you know, every generation throws a literary magazine up the pop charts,
right.
You know. I think that literary magazines start as a voice of a generation, and if the thing works out, they'll end up transcending that generation as magazines, you know.
Right, and yeah, in fact, I was talking to another editor who said that
So, for example, I think Granta started as a student magazine, and now it's Granta, you know.
Yeah, it was a student literary magazine, and it was going out of print. Bill went there, I think, on fellowship and brought it back, and it didn't look like this at all. It was stapled together and, you know, very higgledy-piggledy and nothing like this. So.
And Buford had a fairly specific editorial vision. Do you think that's fair to say? That he, you know, you're saying these magazines that are born as the voice of a generation, there's usually some...
It starts like that.
Some manifesto,
usually.
Some argument about
sort
why
of.
we have to publish a certain kind of writing.
Yeah, no, their argument was that British writing was crap, to put it simply, and that this was before the internet, before Amazon.co UK, before we were getting books shipped around, before we could read newspapers for free, and so lots and lots of really talented and American writers were not being published in England. And so the first issue of this, you know, 100-year-old British student literary magazine that he published was called New American Writing, and it had Susan Sontag and Donald Bartholomew and lots and lots of American writers, Louise Erdrich, Paul Auster, people who here were beginning to be or already were well known, but there were not that well known or read at all. And I think it was just an attempt to kind of shake things up. And shortly after, they published a third issue. It was called The End of the English Novel. So they definitely had a mission and a kind of point of view.
Would you say that survives to this day, or have things changed?
No, not really. I think the thing that survives today is just the desire to put Anglo and American literary influences in friction with each other, but also with the world. And I think the thing which made Granta survive, beyond its sort of early period, because if you read that first issue now, there's book reviews of John Updike's books. There's a very hard-hitting, almost academic essay by Bill that starts it off. It's an uneven issue, but the thing which kept it alive is they immediately expanded to the rest of the world, and they were publishing Garcia Marquez and Vargas Llosa and Ryszard Kapuscinski, and they started publishing memoir and reportage. And I think it's the things which keep magazines alive is not just a vision, but also an outward-looking viewpoint, looking at what's next.
Yeah, I think that's definitely. There's a long tradition in the English-speaking world of the sort of what is not being published. Like, I started Tin House at the same time McSweeney started, and Dave Eggers and I were 4 blocks apart from each other in Brooklyn, and we would see each other and talk about how our friends and people we admired weren't getting published. And I know that was the same thing with George Plimpton in Paris. You know, he wasn't seeing his circle of friends being published, so he wanted to start a literary magazine, and then you have to sort of look outward from there. But I was just in Santiago, Chile, and they really don't have that much of a tradition there of straight, things that look like this. Mm-hmm. There it's much more poetry broadsides and poetry chapbooks. And I was actually at the Catholic University at Santiago at a publishing class where they were trying to come up with a literary magazine.
Yes.
And they were trying to wrap their head around, because they were creating it out of nothing. Mm-hmm. And they were really excited, but they were also scared, because no one's telling them what to do, and it's such a conservative place that they at least the students were like, we don't know who to look to.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Peter, the quarterly that you worked on, was it sort of in this model, or is it something different?
It was quite the same. I mean, it looks quite the same. It's it's called Entwürfe. There are a few differences, I think. One is that it was never about translation. I think none of our literary magazines is about translations, because we have I think about 60% of the books that come out in Europe are translations, or in Germany or Switzerland. So we do have translations. We have lots of small publishing houses who do all kinds of literature, like specialists for India or for whatever. So that's not really a problem. It's mainly for young authors to publish their first texts. Right. I mean, 30 years ago, it was founded by, some of them were founded by major authors, but today it's really mainly for beginners in a way. And then also for authors who have published books, but who have small texts that they cannot really fit into a book that they would give to one of those magazines.
So when you publish short stories now, do you send them to magazines like this?
No, I wouldn't.
Where would you publish them?
In books.
Yeah, right. You're not a beginner, which we know.
No, it's not so common to. It's even when my last collection of short stories came out, almost all of them had been published before, and that's quite unusual. Usually people don't want that, and we discussed whether we should put it in a book where they had been published before, and finally the editor decided not to do it, because he thought it wouldn't really help the book to say everything as just old stuff, even though some of them had just been published in small magazines, and maybe 200 people had read them.
One of the interesting things that's happened in Argentina is that in many cases, magazines are like some sort of transition to the book form. There are people that start the magazine, they publish their pieces there, and once they get a book contract, the magazine disappears.
Oh, that's interesting. It's interesting. Like listening to all three of you, I was thinking, particularly with Rob, what you're talking about takes me back to when I started BLS, Voice Literary Summit, which was considerably earlier than McSweeney's and Tin House. But it was that there were publications, but they weren't publishing the people we were and we loved. Mm-hmm. Sometimes those were synonymous, the ones we were and loved. And so we conceived of ourselves as a place for people beginning, people who had been marginalized for one reason or another. And then, for whatever reason, I was there for 15 years, and we kept a fairly stable group of writers, always bringing new writers in.
Oh, that's great.
But when writers published books, they felt some kind of home tie there. It didn't last forever. It lasted close to 20 years, but that seemed like a good run to us. And translation was not a big thought at that point. When I started the Penn magazine, I was on the board of trustees at Penn, and we were sitting around, and Grace Paley, bless her, was sitting beside me, giving me cheese and bread. She likes to feed me at these meetings, and I wish she were here tonight. And we thought how odd it was suddenly that, sitting there at the table, that this organization of writers and editors didn't have a literary magazine. And Grace said, you know how to do a literary magazine. That can be your service to the organization. And I said, well, okay. And then I began thinking about translation. I began thinking about English and the very small, like 4%, 3% of books in this country that are published in translation. And Penn was this wonderful, wonderful forum for being connected to the rest of the world and
Yeah,
bringing the rest of the world.
But translation is expensive.
Yeah.
That's the point.
Yeah.
Right.
It takes about twice as, 2 to 3 to 4 times as much work.
Right.
If we just sit there and reacted to what was submitted to us, we would publish almost no translation. And we have one member on staff or 2 members on staff who are fluent in French and Spanish, but we also have these 3 foreign editions of Granta, one in Spain, one in Brazil, and one that's starting up in Italy in May. Which is great because we have editors at all those places who speak and read English very well and can sort of be forward guards for us in those languages. And so we'll be, trying to serve Granta Germany, Granta Norway. If there's any Norwegians out there, come talk to me afterwards. But I think the larger thing is that the search for what's next or what's new never ends. And the hard thing about being, I think, an editor is that you realize at a certain point that you have to start moving away from writers who have helped you make your magazine. Which isn't to say that Salman Rushdie and Julian Barnes and Graham Swift and Rose Tremaine and Pat Barker, all these writers who Granta published quite early in their careers are no longer any good. It's just that they, like Rodrigo mentioned, they want to write novels now and not much else. Salman Rushdie will write the occasional essay, but that means that you have to constantly be looking. Because otherwise, I think magazines become they really do become a kind of record of the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And if they don't change from that, then they become kind of stale and die.
Yeah, well, presumably, or perhaps, hopefully, one hopes that if we are alive, then people out there who are writing are going to say, oh, that's a place that I might want to send something,
Right.
that I might feel at home in those pages because the writing in those pages feels alive to me. That's a hope.
Well, Rob, you guys at Tin House have published a lot of work in translation.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have international editions, as far as I know. So how do you find those writers?
It's a mix of, we have an editor in Paris who helps, but I go to a lot of festivals. I've been to festivals in St. Petersburg, Melbourne, Santiago, let's see, where else? Nairobi. I do a lot of traveling and, just like hands-on, and I'm constantly asking everybody I meet at this festival, what's exciting, what's new. And,
Right.
you have to, I can't read every language, so you have to rely on word of mouth, and then
And hand signals.
Yeah, hand signals. Yeah. A lot of trust is involved, and then you have to trust the translator, and a lot of times you'll get something that comes highly recommended, and the translation is not any good, and you're left.
Rodrigo, Peter, you were going to say something?
Yeah, maybe one of the big differences is that you have a huge market. I mean, in Europe you have especially Germany, Switzerland, it's not so big. So you have we had like 1,000, an edition of 1,000, copies, which is not much. So we couldn't even pay for travel. So we couldn't even pay the editors. I mean, everybody was working for free, more or less. So that limited the amount of work we could put into the magazine.
Go ahead.
What are how many copies do you have? Do you sell in your magazine?
Our print runs around 50,000.
Yeah, see,
And
that makes a
half
difference.
of it goes here, and half another actually it's split up all around the world. We have a couple thousand subscribers in Europe. We've got 1,000 in Australia. We've got 2/5 is here. So it gets on a lot of different planes.
Mm.
What's your experience with the online thing? I mean, the physical object against the ghost in the machine.
Well, the weird thing is that I'm always skeptical about online is we can put up a brand new piece online every day by extremely good writers, and we still struggle to get over 3,000 or 4,000 unique visitors a day, and I don't know why. And I had a similar experience when I worked with the National Book Critics Circle. We had brand new short stories that George Saunders gave us for free. We had Richard Ford on there. We were just putting up 5 pieces a day, and on the biggest, highest day, it was like 2,500. And the really depressing thing is we would get a link from Andrew Sullivan, or one of these political bloggers, and we'd have 12,000 hits in one day. And it made me realize that in some ways, the market of literary magazines, or just reading good writing in that form, is actually quite diffuse and small.
Right. Yeah, in fact, there's a quote I dug up from Rick Moody. He was talking about George Plimpton at Paris Review, and he said, George and I used to talk about this all the time, and he knew exactly who his audience was. 3,000 people in the creative writing programs, the teachers and the students, and then those odd persons on the outside who actually take an interest in literary culture. And that's not such a bad crew, they really care. But it sounds like, you have reached beyond that 3,000.
Well, we did a reader survey shortly before I got there, and I asked our subscription manager, what's our average subscriber? And they said, well, basically, it's a 55-year-old divorced guy who collects wine. I was like, all right, we have to make some changes. But that's why, I don't know if you've seen our cover. It's slightly arresting.
Great.
That's why we're trying to make a better effort about how the magazine looks, because as much as we like to believe in that words are a virus and that ideas move in mysterious ways and that language has a kind of occult power over us and that people read to live, basically we live in a capital economy and things are products and they have to be seen and it has to be places. And
yeah.
It's a depressing but very necessary part of the job is to make it stand out. So we've got a brand new art director who's kind of a genius and is making films to go with the pieces. And all this stuff, I don't think, because it is so genuinely engaged with the actual text itself, doesn't feel like shilling or selling. It's just also a fun way to, package things.
I think it's interesting. There's while we do a lot of online stuff and I post a lot of things, but people want a tactile, well-designed object. They want something that's looks like a book that you can keep around and have on your coffee table. And
No, it has some sort of aristocratic flair.
yeah,
There was a piece published, very polemical, a couple of years ago by Javier Marias, the Spanish writer in Spain, and he was saying something kind of Swiftian, like a modest proposal. He said that he was completely tired of all these campaigns saying everybody has to read magazines, read books, and he proposed that maybe the clue was going completely the other way. He said, don't read, you're not worthy of it. Make reading something pretty dandy, exclusive, aristocratic thing, and people will come like, I want to read, I want to read, I want to read. And in a way, it worked. I think it sounds logical, because I remember one of my most, I was sad but happy at the same time that the same day that the iPad was launched was paradoxically the same day that J.T. Salinger died. So for 15 minutes, I remember it was like, you tune in or you read online and it was iPad. And suddenly Salinger for 15 minutes. But for 15 minutes, we were talking again about content, not just, the bottle. And I think maybe that's the clue. Let's go back to, maybe I'll have just 10,000 readers, but they'll be the best ones in a way,
But I'm not sure about the future, because we talked about the future. We still have these But young authors today, because you said it's usually a group of authors who found a newspaper and then they get older with it. New authors now, they do publish much more in the internet, and I think for them it's, I don't know how many clicks they have, but it seems that it's somehow working. So there are a few projects in Germany and in Switzerland that are only published in the internet.
Well, there's a magazine here called Electric Literature, which is very good. And, they have, I think, a few thousand actual print copies, and then an iPhone app. And
but I think the problem with the internet is that people has grown accustomed to read online short texts. I mean, if there's a many pages piece long on the internet, people sort of.
You know, I've been surprised working with undergraduates, a couple of whom are here tonight, or former undergraduates, about preferences in young people. I teach literature and reading and writing for the most part, but I also am interested in new media. And I'm starting a new media program in London for Vassar. And so I've been paying a little more attention to it. And what I'm finding among my students is a real resistance to giving up books. I mean, really a heartfelt resistance to giving up books. And I see very few exceptions to that. They tend, if anything, to think, and it seems to me a healthy and interesting way to consider all these days, they think about supplements. They'll have their books, they'll have other things online, there won't be a choice between one or the other. The book will not be dying.
Mm-hmm.
You know, video
I'm happy to hear it.
did not kill the radio. You know, if you're writing radio plays.
Sure.
But I've been struck by the sort of passion that they bring to this. There was, David and I found an article about a sort of pilot program that Kindle did at Princeton a few months ago, using Kindles for textbooks. And they did, afterwards they did interviews, quite intensive interviews. And the faculty were saying, well, you know, not so bad. We kind of liked it. The students were probably, they hated it. They couldn't make marginal notes. They wanted it for textbooks.
Yeah.
And this is what I found with my students too. I don't, you know, when I hear people worry that the future does not involve books,
Yes.
I think.
I think the problem is that the future doesn't involve bookstores. That's a natural worry, because if bookstores can't pay their rents and people don't buy books in the same ways, there's no place that people go to sort of interact and identify themselves with readers. I think that's a bigger problem than what's
We were just talking about you lost it during your family.
In fact, you know, I've always felt that I start reading the book the minute I'm looking for the bookstore to buy it. You know, it's part of the experience. And you know, still, iPads are still not designed by Chip Kidd. So maybe when they look nicer, but they're still not a screen.
Yeah, I think it depends on the society too. I was in Australia and they don't have Amazon there, and so they don't have price discounting. So Melbourne has hundreds of little bookstores, and they have dozens of little magazines. And some of the bookstores are right near each other, and you'd think in this country they would, there would be one on the block, but there are 4 on the block, and they're a little boutique-y, it was really inspiring to be there. And I was on a panel and they asked, well, what could we learn from the U.S.? I'm like, nothing, just please don't import anything, please, it's horrible.
So is there something we can learn from them?
Well, if we run really fast backwards in reverse time.
No, what I can say is, I mean, when you go online, most of the times you know what you're going to buy. When you go into a bookstore, most of the time you're going to buy a book, but you find another thing there. Something you weren't looking for.
Well, that's
But
why
I think it's part of the fun.
that's why I don't mean to be surface oriented, but that's why we're trying to make our issues beautiful. Because we have to stop somebody from looking at something else to say, well, what the hell's that? I've never seen that before.
But I think what people are looking at the internet, it's not, as you said, you put those wonderful authors in the internet, nobody would want to read them. Maybe they look for something different, and that's these new magazines. They don't publish like short stories of famous authors. It's more like a lifestyle that they have texts that really are written very fast, and they have like poetry. It's a whole performance thing. I think it's really a different way to do literary magazines in a way.
Well, the bigger question, I think, is in what ways are the forms that we consider literary, whether it's a short story or long-form reportage or certain types of poetry, are they engendered or created by the way that we've read them? Like in 20, 50 years, if more and more writers are writing for screens or writing for electronic devices, will their paragraphs get shorter? Will their stories get shorter? And in what sense, what kind of experience of the world will that give us if that's what we're reading? I think that's, it's...
I was at the LA Times Festival of Books over the weekend, and there was a panel about this. Nicholas Carr, who's written several books about it, he was making an argument that that hardwiring happens when you read diffusely, when you're reading, jumping from screen to screen, and that it's not just a lifestyle choice, but there's a hardwiring going on that over time is going to make it sort of incapable of going back to reading a long form. That's his argument. I don't agree with, but it's an interesting argument.
No, but I think you can have both. Because as you said, there are children read books, and if you take a train in Switzerland, everybody's reading a book. So it doesn't really, one doesn't exclude the other. But there is this internet thing that's more than just the internet version of one of our magazines. That's really something new with videos, with voice recordings, with pictures. It's a completely different format.
Yeah, but maybe we all can do both because we are like some sort of borderline generation. I mean, we've known both worlds, but what is going to happen with someone who starts writing, writing?
I think escapism is always going to be there, and the long form escapism. I have an 11-year-old son, and he plays World of Warcraft all the time. I mean, he's obsessed with going through levels, but at night,
with that?
No, too. But he reads.
Yeah.
He loves the escape. He reads all the Leighton Thief books, and that it's a different kind of engagement and escape than World of Warcraft. I don't think so. All of his friends, all of his friends talk about the Lightning Thief.
But rather,
Maybe the name of the school they go, please.
Yeah.
Has this changed? As publishing things on the web, though, because one of the things that has always defined Granta is like the really long form. We have a piece in an issue called "The Murdery" by Ian Jack, and it's about the murder of 3 so-called IRA terrorists in Gibraltar in 1988, and it's 89 pages long in the issue, which means it's probably 35,000 words. And when we publish pieces online, some of them are as short as 500 words. I mean, Rodrigo had 2 pieces for us, and they're almost long enough that they could have gone into a print issue. But other pieces that we have there, we had a great one by Maud Newton, which was like this fantastic piece of origami. But if it was on the page, it may not have felt as good. And it's changing to a small degree what we're looking at, what we're considering as sort of a Granta piece.
Well, I think too there was a Mary Gateskill memoir you guys published recently, and it was quite long, but it wasn't book length. So if there hadn't been a literary magazine, I mean, where would that be? I mean, obviously you think, oh, Mary Gateskill published wherever she wants, but actually, where would you publish that if not?
Well, it's our benefit for that, but weirdly, we put that piece up online, and it was one of the best memoirs I've ever read. I mean, because it sounds ridiculous. She lost her cat. Oh, boo-hoo. But she, gradually turns this piece about a lost cat into a meditation on loss and what's an appropriate vessel for loss and what's an appropriate response to loss. And we put that piece online, and I thought, lots of people were talking about it, and it got tweeted and retweeted, and I watched the statistics, and it got good traffic, but people eventually dropped off in a way, and I can't imagine that the number of people who dropped off online would have dropped off if they were reading it in the page.
Mm-hmm. Right. So you can tell there are multiple pages, and they sort of read the first couple and then they stop.
Yeah, and you don't even know what happens to the cat at that point.
Right. Well, one of the magazines you mentioned earlier, I think McSweeney's was published, sort of started around the same time as you, and when they started, they had 2 entirely different missions for the website and print journal. So the website is these short pieces, kind of comic pieces mostly, and then the journal is this incredibly lavishly printed, journal published quarterly, like everyone else.
Ever changing.
Yeah, and Tin House in the same way, right? That when you started it, part of the impetus was we're going to make this really beautiful. Do you think that remains as relevant?
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think the sort of long-short dichotomy, McSweeney's and Tin House both publish books, and we both we publish longer books that the mainstream publishers are afraid to publish. Like McSweeney's did William Volman's History of Violence thing that no major publisher, I mean, the guy won the National Book Award, but no publisher would touch that book, but McSweeney's would, and they did all right by it. And we're doing...
So are you publishing something as long as that?
No. I mean, the craziest thing I'm doing, we're publishing a South African novel called Agat, which was 750 manuscript pages, and she's going to be in conversation with Toni Morrison on Saturday. And it's a book that should easily have been published by a bigger house, but it's written in Afrikaans, 750 manuscript pages.
Have you met people when you go to these conferences? Have you actually ended up with pieces that are in your bag and you come back and you read them and they're good?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
How have you, Peter and Rodrigo, since you've published in magazines and published books in translation, have you been involved in that process? Have you reached out to editors in other countries, or they reached out to you? How did that ever happen for you?
I mean, editors of books or of magazines?
Magazines, if you've had that experience.
No, I've never actually done that. No, I've been publishing like collections of like something like Best European Fiction or something like I don't know how you call that.
Anthology.
An anthology, yeah, right. But I've never actually contacted any magazines.
Yeah. No,
you should contact
because
us. This is happening right now.
Right.
This is what these conferences
but we are
are for.
far away. Because I wouldn't have known how to do it. I mean, because if I get the translation, it's already ready to be published, so it's too late in a way. If I don't have a translation, it's no use to send you a German text because you don't.
But we have readers, and we pay for readers' reports, and just trust the readers.
And Japan is very lucky to have a translation program. So we have translators we can.
In Argentina, I was in charge of the monthly magazine of a newspaper. That the thing of the magazine that was published with a video cassette of a movie classic, and all the magazine was around the movie. For example, I mean, Citizen Kane was a whole issue on journalism, and we translated a lot. But I have to confess that we stole everything. We never consulted anyone, and we never paid anything. I mean. I'm talking here in first person, but those were the guidelines I received. I mean,
I know that from the other side, yeah. When I was in China, they told me that they had, very proud that they had published like 20 stories of mine. And I said, could I at least have a copy of the magazine?
Yes.
But they just do it.
On the good side, I have to say that many, this is like some sort of consolation prize. I'm not trying to convince you of anything. But many writers that weren't completely unknown in Argentina later well translated and published their books because of our Robin Hood sort of modus operandi.
I've spent a fair amount of
But
time.
Robin took it from the rich and not from the poor.
Oh yeah, I know we're all poor.
I spent a lot of time in particularly East Africa, and so the means of production there it's very expensive to produce books, and it's really prohibitively expensive to ship books from across borders. It's really hard for Kenyans to get Nigerian books and vice versa. So a lot of stuff is put up on the web, like as soon as it is written, and it's sort of understood there that you would put it up very quickly because internet cafes are very cheap. Most of my friends there have this philosophy that it comes back to you. Like Binyavanga Wainaina's piece, How to Write About Africa.
That's the most searched piece on our website ever. Every
Every
day 1,000 people read that piece. I think it might be him like 1,000 times.
It is. But it's all of his friends too, because when I was with him in Nairobi, he would, like every single day, he would get people sending that piece to him with his name off of it. Like they didn't know where it had come from, and they said, "Oh my God, you've got to check out this piece." And he would go like, "Yeah, I wrote it." It had gone so viral that, but because of that piece that is disseminated everywhere, he's kind of the go-to guy for East
Yes,
African journalism.
That's what I mean, I'm not
You know.
trying to make any excuses, but you have to understand that, for example, when you're living under a military dictatorship or a place where the local currency against the dollar is like $1 equals 2 million pesos, for example, you know, the only way, you know, to do this kind of things and make people known, I mean, you can pay, for example, $300 for a piece. It's impossible for any magazine or any newspaper, you know, to affront that kind of thing. So,
In the new issue of Pen America, there's a conversation between this Congolese writer Alan Mabankou, who I think you published in your anthology, with the Haitian writer Daniel Ferrier, and he talks about Alan talks about how hard it is to get books in his country. But he says when you get a book out there, when someone actually brings a book, say if he goes there, that book will be read by 200 people. Whereas when he sells a book in France, he writes in French, people put it on their shelves and they never read it.
Yeah. To tell you the most extreme case, I was telling you yesterday night, I worked for a magazine and they had this, it was my first job, they had this great photograph of a very, very famous American writer. And they said, well, your first job is going to interview this guy. And it was like, wow, they sent me to New York. And they said, no, invent it. We have the photos, invent the interview. And I did it. And the thing is, 2 years later, I received a letter in the magazine from this author whose name won't be mentioned here. And he says, sorry, but I don't remember having been given this interview. But strangely, I agree with everything I say there. So I'm not taking any measures now, but don't do it again. You know?
Well, I want to get back to this this question of the relationship between writers, young writers, writers that are starting out, and these magazines. I just came across something that was published online this week, and I think Rob, you saw it as well. There was a ranking of literary magazines, and it was by a young writer named Lincoln Mitchell, who lives in New York, and he said explicitly at the top that this is not a ranking of my favorites. In fact, if it was, a lot of the ones at the bottom would be at the top. Those are the ones I actually like to read.
Mm-hmm.
But as a young writer trying to get started, these are the ones that will be seen by an agent, seen by an editor, get into an anthology, and there are people who now track. And there's a funny way in which, I mean, it is the magazines that have survived that first excitement and managed to live on, and then like Granta, like Tin House, been around 11 years now, that are near the top of this list, that are now sort of established.
So why the fuck does he want to read us?
I'm not sure that he does. Why doesn't he want to read it?
Yeah, he said he doesn't necessarily want to read the ones
at the top. I don't know, he may not have mentioned Granta specifically.
Well, he also has started a really cool new magazine called Gigantic. Yeah, and you know, he and his friends, they're all recent Columbia grads. They're reading, you know, they're not reading the sort of more established. They're reading what the cool kids are reading.
James, yeah.
Which,
yeah.
Which is the way it should be. I mean, I have all my interns read all the cool new literary magazines and point things out to me because I'm.
See, I think you should do both though. I mean,
not
necessarily
absolutely.
reading older magazines, but I think the vitality and energy and of sort of ambition, which is basically new literary magazines. They're somewhat about ambition. Is important for some people to keep writing, you know, because it's an act which, you know, otherwise you just simply put it in a drawer and put it away. But if writers only read that, I think they wind up sort of hamstrung. Because I think so many of the writers that I know who I really, really admire, that you ask them what they're reading, and it's all over the map. I mean, you know, those end of the year lists where it says, "What are you reading now?" And whenever I've had to do those for Granta, people say, "Do I have to mention a new book?" You know, and I think some of the excitement about literary magazines is really about that sort of collision of ambition and aesthetic.
And there's something that still happens here. I remember me when I was younger being completely starstruck, you know, about hearing this sort of Hollywood-esque thing that you publish your short story in an American magazine and you're famous. That never ever happened in Argentina. No, and there are
But
this
did it
whole-
happen?
Huh?
Did it happen here?
Yeah. Well, there are these stories.
What happened to Mark
of
Twain?
People, going,
Mark Twain's
running
story.
down the streets to buy the New Yorker with the new Salinger short story, for example. Or I remember when there were pieces, because I was subscribed to the New Yorker, when there were like pieces of Michael Cunningham's first or second, well, actually it's his second novel.
White Angel.
Yes, that everybody was talking about it,
But it's a matter of proportion. Do you know Alberto Fuguet, a Chilean writer? He
Yes,
came.
really good friend.
He came here to visit, and the best stories of the century had just come out. This was a while ago, and there was a big party for it. And it was like all these heavyweight writers were there, people that never go to parties. It was like Kurt Vonnegut, John Updike, and it was like, Grace Paley was there. It was like this, I couldn't have taken him to a better party. I was like, all right, this is cool. And so I take him in and he's like, meh. And I'm like, what do you mean, meh? And he's like, well,
I know Alberto, Alberto.
Where are your judges? Where are your congressmen? Where are your senators? And I was like, what are you talking about? And it's like, well, in Santiago, if you have a big literary event, you have to have.
No, but he was like bluffing, he's like.
But still, I was like, but he was like, we were talking about circulation too.
In Slovenia, the big literary festival of Lipica was actually opened by the Prime Minister. He would actually come. It does happen in other countries, not in Switzerland.
But who cares?
Well,
Well,
Rodrigo,
for me, I would be completely disgusted and ashamed to go to a literary party in Argentina and seeing the president coming in. I mean, what are you doing there? What are you doing here? Go back to your pink house, because it's not the White House, it's the pink house in Argentina. Really.
But you've also, putting aside politicians, you also write for newspapers in Spain,
Yeah.
is that right? And that, we were talking about this yesterday, that's not uncommon in Spain. Marias, who you mentioned, writes for newspaper. Antonio Munoz Molina writes for newspapers. That doesn't really happen in this country.
So in fact, I'm a foreign correspondent for an Argentinian newspaper, Página 12, and it was a newspaper completely founded by fiction writers who decided one day, we want to read the news better written, So they started covering being fiction writers. And I think, I don't know now, but there was a time that 80% of the people working in the newspaper, going there every day, were fiction writers, covering the news.
Well, that's the difference between maybe South America and North America, because so a lot of the newspaper founders in this country are either politicians or businessmen. Alexander Hamilton was a newspaper owner and publisher. Dewey, newspaper publisher. So I think it's used in different ways in this country. But what I find quite interesting is the difference between America and England, because England doesn't have a magazine and literary journal culture. So we're sort of we're it. It's if we fuck it up, that's pretty idiotic. Because there's nothing else there.
Do you have a sense of why people have? Greta's been around for a while now. Why haven't people kind of followed it?
I don't know. I think part of it might have to do with the do-it-yourself culture in America, at least in this part of the country. So what I was going to say is a lot of writers, the Sunday supplements are great because you go there and Ian McEwan and Zadie Smith and Carol Phillips and all these other writers who would normally be publishing those types of pieces in magazines are publishing them in newspapers because the newspaper supplements are enriched.
Well, and you wonder to what extent that then affects how, to get back to the original question, how that affects the way people, what they imagine literature to be.
Well, it's more democratic. I think about that a lot. This is $18.99. I wish 5 million people could read it.
It's only 15 tonight.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, David.
Yes.
Yeah, how many times can you buy sex for $15? Bad joke, sorry. You should have heard the other jokes we made in the office during this issue. But don't you think about this, Rob? Like,
Yeah, absolutely.
if you want, I think part of literature is like you want to change the world. You want to change people's lives, and if you are simply giving this to people whose lives are already pretty good. No offense to you guys.
No, it's true. I mean, you could even, consider the form of the literary magazine. As you said, it's expensive, it's big, it only comes out a few times a year. So really, it's sort of resisting topicality in a way.
Well, the only thing is that it can go into libraries, and as much as you want to sit around and wait for your turn at the library stall on the computer, that's why I feel like in some ways print is still a little bit more democratic, is because it will, eventually someone will get this and take it to the used bookshop and you can buy it for $1. Don't do that, but I feel like that's really important. If you only are on the web, then you really rely on people's connectivity and
knowing where to go and being tipped off. I mean, the web, you have to type in an address. So unless you see a link to something somewhere, you can't get back to the bookshop thing, the accidental discovery.
Yeah, I mean that's how I started.
But maybe we're the last romantics. Who knows?
Yeah, but that's my dream. Started in a used bookstore in Baltimore, reading the Paris Review Writers at Work. That was definitely which I could get for $1. Because I had no money.
Well, I want to make sure we have time for people in the audience to ask questions, so I will throw it open now. It's a little hard to see, but if you want to just
Lights on.
see a hand over here.
Yeah, I have a question to John Freeman. Were you selected to go to England for the British journal because you were the man for the job, the person for the job, or did they want to infuse some American look or view or openness to the journal?
well, I was hired as the American editor, and there were some changes at the magazine, and I was the next guy standing. But I think their interest in hiring me originally was that they felt like the magazine, even though it had become sort of a British institution, had always, in some ways, had its roots in the kind of vitality and energy of American prose, and that they felt perhaps they had lost some of that. So they hired me to be here, to put on events, to buy pieces, to look for new writers, to go to festivals, and this, that, and the other thing. But my response to being the editor is I don't want to just think about America and England. I think we should look at the entire world.
Yeah, I have to say that now they're like sort of preparing to launch in Spain the Granta issue on best writers in Spanish. There's like an earthquake going on.
Well,
Who's
we're
going to be in there?
That's going to be our fall issue, actually. This issue I think has more in translation than we've had in a while. After this, we have an issue called Going Back. After that, we have an issue on Pakistan. And the fall issue, as Rodrigo mentioned, is the best young Spanish language novelist, which we are running entirely out of our Spanish Granta.
I'm so happy being over 35. Really happy.
But I think, what is theater without Chekhov or Ibsen? You don't simply think, oh, they must write in English in order to be good playwrights. And the same thing about poets. And so it feels quite straightforward to me to think that way. As for me being hired, it's still a mystery to me, but I'm not going to question it.
Also, if you're, frankly, I think you're probably in the same boat that I am. I get about 2,000 submissions a month, and
I love how you say that with such a steady voice.
While his son is playing War of Apocalypse.
But I would say 90% of them have no reason to exist. There's no urgency at all to 90% of these things, and I think the inverse proportion, if you're looking at foreign fiction, for me, the things I read from anywhere else have a lot more energy and vitality because they have a sense of urgency to them.
Well, someone also had to spend several months of their life translating it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's a pretty good test.
Yeah, and by the time it gets to us and is translated or a reader reads it, so it's, I'm personally more excited about, looking for things abroad with a sense of, that have more of a sense of urgency than a lot of the stuff I read here at home.
It kind of gets back to the the comment from Lincoln Mitchell's piece about these aren't the magazines I like to read, but these are the ones I want to be in. Because I imagine many of those thousands of submissions are people who don't read Tin House, or they at least don't subscribe. Maybe they're vaguely aware of it, and there is this disconnect, I think, between writers and these magazines. It's a professional step that they want to take.
Well, they buy this writer's handbook, I guess, with all the addresses, and they send.
And
I guess.
Yeah, literary marketplace, it's called. Yeah, and there's no excuse for it because you can go on any of our websites and actually read samples and get a sense of, our voice.
But I totally agree with Rob, because I've been going around to universities to talk to students, and this is gonna sound like some editor whining, but like if you have money for beer on the weekends, you can buy a literary magazine. It's not that hard. And I do get that sense that people want to be in a magazine rather than read it or buy it. And so they'll just assume that it's going to always be there. And I always think that's sort of a moral choice, like how you spend your money is a moral question, whatever. But I sort of welcome the fact that people will submit us stuff that's not appropriate. Because I think, we're publishing more poetry. This new issue has poems by Ann Carson and C.K. Williams and Carl Phillips and David Kirby. And we don't, on our website, I think we might even actively discourage against that. But, some stuff that we get in is stuff that isn't appropriate, but it ends up being right. And one of the things I think that's just part of being an editor is reading through lots and lots of submissions to find something that's deeply and wonderfully inappropriate.
Yeah, I love being proved wrong. I have a real bugaboo against second person. I will never publish second person, and so all my editors actively look for second person stories to prove me wrong, and I'm forced to publish them.
And I'm curious, in English, do agents submit material to the magazine? Okay.
Other question right here?
Yeah, I have several comments or questions. The man in the blue shirt, what magazine?
Rob?
Tin House.
Tin House.
Tin House.
Tin House.
Like a tin. T-I-N.
Tin House.
I don't see literature, and many of the people I know don't read or write for escapist purposes. You want to write genre fun. But you left out, everyone there, the alternative press in New York, in America. You mentioned the gentleman from Germany, Switzerland, that in your community there was an alternative press, but that's only for beginners.
No, the alternative press is not for beginners. That's for all kinds of books.
Do the people stay beginners? I was a fiction editor for a thing called Home Planet News for 15 years. I've been posting it twice only because they wanted to take part of the book I was working on. I said, yeah, I want to use the space, which was limited. I started with my home, but
Let me let Rob respond if you have
Wait, so what is the question about money? I mean, where?
Like money, the magazine Home Planet News could never have afforded anything.
Right.
Go to Coney Island. We went to every
Sure.
place.
Oh yeah,
I assumed that was paid for by periodic.
Yeah,
Sure.
I'm completely lucky. I have a sole backer who's my publisher.
Yeah, most American writers teach.
Yeah.
And Gordy Dollar says, you won't get any more good American writing, because all writers teach. You get this bland amalgam of the American experience.
So maybe we need more very wealthy people who will back magazines like Rob and Granta. Any other questions? No?
It's really hard to see up there.
I know it is hard to see.
We'll talk about anything, really.
All right, well, if...
We're not that
Okay, this one right here.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, we're very active with, like Facebook and Twitter, and that's been a little more, you see a lot more immediate response from that. And we run a literary festival every summer in Oregon, and there's sort of an active community that's built up around that online. And we're about to do a lot more online. I'm a firm believer in putting up as much content for free as possible. So this summer I'm going to try to put up as much, whatever we have rights to, I'm going to start putting up for free, because I believe it comes back to you.
What was the question again?
About creating community online.
No, I think that's actually one of the most useful things about the internet. We have a Facebook page, we have a Twitter feed. Our readers are all over the world, and it's a great way to keep in touch with them. And we probably have 100 events a year, so it's a great way to get the word out about events. But I don't think you can have just that. I think you have to have a real world presence, like Rob was saying about actually going to festivals. It sounds luxurious, but you go there and you stand in the hot sun in a booth selling 8 issues of Granta on a weekend in Los Angeles. Let me tell you, it doesn't get more glamorous than that.
Absolutely.
But
it also serves as a calling card internationally. We have writers from around the world send us stuff just because they've seen us online and they want to be in an American magazine.
But do you think then that magazine publishers had to work more like scouts in a way?
Well, but that's the fun of it. I mean, I don't think if you don't want to do that, you shouldn't be a magazine editor.
Yeah, that's the fun of it, is when we get to brag that we discovered so and so. That's that's the exciting.
So what does the Tin House calling card say? Who's on it?
Like, who have we discovered?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I don't know, one of my favorites is Alex Lemon, poet Alex Lemon, who just has
With that
happy memoir. Yeah, he came to my festival, and just really exciting. He's also a Chinese translator and just really dynamic, interesting writer.
Does your journal publish anyone brand new in it?
Well, you started to, yeah, more and more. And also, I mean, I think there's a certain amount of pride in discovering, to some extent, an international writer who maybe doesn't have as much.
Because then you own them for the rest of their life. Follow them around.
There was a Saudi Arabian writer that we published, and we weren't the first to discover him.
Yusuf
Al-Muhammad. We met him because he came to the World Voices Festival, and he had one book published in English, but it hadn't really sold a lot in English. And at the festival, he said, what are you working on now? Do you have more in translation? And the piece that he gave us ended up winning the Pushcart Prize and going in the Pushcart Anthology. So hopefully, there's an editor who sees that. And
no, I did. I actually got pieces
I
from him.
think that's a really important part of an editor's job, is to go out there and look and hope that we can then help people along the road, which might lead to Tin House or Granta or some other magazine or publisher. That's something that's really close to the center of why I want to be an editor, is just to give people a chance. And the translation, to repeat, we feel really lucky because Penn does good translation grants. And so yes, some of the translations we see are by beginning translators, but we do have a chance to read in English a number of people who hadn't been published here before.
Yeah, it's really exciting when you publish something that like Per Pedersen's Outstealing Horses. I did an excerpt of that, and that was one of those things where I just loved the writing, and I thought, well, I'm kind of doing a mitzvah here, like putting it out there. Maybe, hopefully, a couple people will write, buy the book, and it blew up.
And again, it was Grey Wolf too. So again, it was an independent press also publishing the book, and they ended up selling more copies than they ever do. Yeah. Anybody else? You got a hand right here.
I just wanted to raise this question of, there's so many unpublished writers who have been trying for years, collecting rejection slips from magazines like your own, and it's a story we've all heard, and we've heard many published writers collected rejection slips for X number of years before somehow they finally got a break. And you've been talking about, a little bit about your criteria for selecting material, looking for material that has a certain urgency. And I just wanted to know if you could address the aspiring unpublished writers who are trying and trying and trying and wondering what we're doing wrong, rewriting stuff, and wondering what's lacking in our material to get published. I mean, there's all kinds of things you can do. You can have someone look at it, you can have a professor look at it, you can hire an editor to do some kind of assessment. Anyway, I just was wondering if you could address that.
I think persistence is, Scott Fitzgerald ranked up, 97 rejections from the New Yorker before he finally got a story published there. That's a really impossible question. It's sort of people ask me all the time, what am I looking for? And my simple answer is I'm looking to miss my subway stop. I'm looking to read a manuscript on the subway and look up and go, oh shit, I'm in Harlem and I live in Brooklyn. It's as simple as that. I want to be sucked into the world so completely, fiction, nonfiction, poetry, that I'm forget what I'm doing. It's really hard to
and maybe you should
words.
For what it's worth, and I don't think this will comfort you a lot, but it is true. I've been to more than one dinner party where well-known, lauded novelists have had sort of contests about who has been rejected or who was rejected the most times before finally getting a book published or getting a story published. So after they've gone through this pain, it becomes a good anecdote, and they can sort of say, oh, I was 28 times, 32. And I gave a reading once, and there was one person in the audience, and I started to read, and she got up and walked out. It turned out she was just eating her lunch there, So it becomes a sort of badge of I was there. But I know that doesn't lessen the pain while you're trying and failing, to know that it's going to be a good story later on.
And I have a question. With the passing of years, as publishers, are you raising the bar? Are you lowering, or are you staying like medium in terms of accepting material or not? Are you much more exigent?
There's only so much room we have. We're limited by the size of the physical space.
Well, this is again.
But have you learned to wait for better things, worth things, or medium
I don't know
things?
what you do, Rob, but we read and we also go after stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the thing which I would say in response to your question is there are pieces, like there's a piece at the start of The Sex Issue by Mark Doty, and it's about being married to a woman and falling in love with a man 35 years ago. And I asked Mark to write this piece because I wanted there to be a piece about being broadsided by desire in a sex issue, and how sex can change your life, and how in some ways the gay community has an undertow that the straight one doesn't, which is that we don't walk around suspecting gay people to be straight on the street, but there's a shadow life to that, and I felt like Mark had to write this piece. And I knew he had written about being married to a woman, and so I commissioned him, and I felt like he was the only person I wanted to write this piece. And I guess when you're writing and you're trying to get published, I think you just need to find something that you absolutely have to write. That if you had a month to live, you would work on just that. And I think that kind of urgency, there's things that only you know, that you've experienced, that there's a story that you could tell. But it means that you have to really just be absolutely fanatically hard on yourself to tell it just the right way. And I don't know if it's just pure stupidity or populism, but I do feel like a lot of people have a story that they could tell. The question is just shaping it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's also about. I always tell young authors that the problem is not to find an editor. The problem is to find to write a good text. And I've seen so many people who have one text and they go from one editor to the next with it, and don't think about maybe that's just not a good text, and maybe I should start anew. I think I wrote about 3 novels before I wrote one that
It hadn't really sold a lot in English, and at the festival he said, what are you working on now? Do you have more in translation? And the piece that he gave us ended up winning a Pushcart Prize and going in the Pushcart anthology. So hopefully there's an editor who sees that. And
No, I did. I actually
Yeah,
got pieces
I
from
think
him.
that's
Thanks
a
to
really
that.
important part of an editor's job, is to go out there and look and hope that we can then help people along the road, which might lead to Tin House or Granta or some other magazine or publisher. Yeah, that feels, that's something that's really close to the center of why I want to be an editor, is just to give people a chance. And the translation, to repeat, we feel really lucky because Penn does good translation grants. And so yes, some of the translations we see are by beginning translators, but we do have a chance to read in English a number of people who hadn't been published here before.
Yeah, it's really exciting when you publish something that like Per Pedersen's Out Stealing Horses. I did an excerpt of that, and that was one of those things where I just loved the writing, and I thought, well, I'm kind of doing a mitzvah here, like putting it out there. Maybe, hopefully, a couple people will write, buy the book, and it blew up.
And
was
again,
huge.
there's Grey Wolf too. So again, it was
Yeah.
an independent press also publishing the book, and they ended up selling more copies than they ever do.
Yeah.
Anybody else? You got a hand right here?
I just wanted to raise this question of, there's so many unpublished writers who have been trying for years, collecting rejection slips from news magazines like your own, and it's a story we've all heard, and we've heard many published writers collected rejection slips for X number of years before somehow they finally got a break. And you've been talking about a little bit about your criteria for selecting material, looking for material that has a certain urgency, and I just wanted to know if you could address the aspiring unpublished writers who are trying and wondering what we're doing wrong, rewriting stuff, and wondering what's lacking in our material to get published. There's all kinds of things you can do. You can have someone look at it, you can have a professor look at it, you can hire an editor to do some kind of assessment. Anyway, I just was wondering if you could address that.
I think persistence is Scott Fitzgerald ranked up, 97 rejections from the New Yorker before he finally got a story published there. That's a really impossible question. It's sort of people ask me all the time, what am I looking for? And my simple answer is I'm looking to miss my subway stop. I'm looking to read a manuscript on the subway and look up and go, oh shit, I'm in Harlem and I live in Brooklyn. It's as simple as that. I want to be sucked into the world so completely, fiction, nonfiction, poetry, that I'm forget what I'm doing. It's really hard to
maybe
that
you should
into words.
For what it's worth, and I don't think this will comfort you a lot, but it is true. I've been to more than one dinner party where well-known, lauded novelists have had sort of contests about who has been rejected or who was rejected the most times before finally getting a book published or getting a story published. So after they've gone through this pain, it becomes a good anecdote, and they can sort of say, oh, I was 28 times, 32. And I gave a reading once, and there was one person in the audience, and I started to read, and she got up and walked out. It turned out she was just eating her lunch there, So it becomes a sort of badge of I was there. But I know that doesn't lessen the pain while you're trying and failing, to know that it's going to be a good story later on.
And I have a question. With the passing of years, as publishers, are you raising the bar? Are you lowering, or are you staying like medium in terms of accepting material or not? Are you much more exigent?
There's only so much room we have. We're limited by the size of the physical space.
Well, this is again where the
But have you learned to wait for better things, worth things, or medium
I don't know
things?
what you do, Rob, but we read and we also go after stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the thing which I would say in response to your question is there are pieces, like there's a piece at the start of The Sex Issue by Mark Doty, and it's about being married to a woman and falling in love with a man 35 years ago. And I asked Mark to write this piece because I wanted there to be a piece about, being broadsided by desire in a sex issue, and how sex can change your life, and how in some ways the gay community has an undertow that the straight one doesn't, which is that we don't walk around suspecting, gay people to be straight on the street, but there's a shadow life to that, and I felt like Mark had to write this piece. And I knew he had written about being married to a woman, and so I commissioned him, and I felt like he was the only person I wanted to write this piece. And I guess when you're writing and you're trying to get published, I think you just need to find something that you absolutely have to write. That if you had a month to live, you would work on just that. And I think that kind of urgency, there's things that only you know, that you've experienced, that there's a story that you could tell. But it means that you have to really just be absolutely fanatically hard on yourself to tell it just the right way. And I don't know if it's just pure stupidity or populism, but I do feel like a lot of people have a story that they could tell. The question is just shaping it.
Yeah,
And it's also,
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's also about, I always tell young authors that the problem is not to find an editor, the problem is to find, to write a good text. And I've seen so many people who have one text and they go from one editor to the next with it, and don't think about, maybe that's just not a good text and maybe I should start anew. I think I wrote about 3 novels before I wrote one that was ready to be published, 3 bad novels. I'm happy that they didn't come out now. But at the time, of course, I thought, well, I'm a genius and nobody sees it. But you have to come to a point where you see, maybe I'm not a genius and maybe I should start anew and write another one.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer that good work rises, and that I engage with writers that I think have promise, and my record is rejecting 13 stories by one person before I'm corresponding with this one person for 13 stories before I bought her 14th. And she was working very difficult. It's a woman named Robin.
So that meant you had like 13 different variations of no.
Yeah. But also but it wasn't a steady progression. It was like no, and this is better. No, this is worse. This is not working at all. It was like up and down over.
So it was like a workshop.
Yeah, it was like over. But I believed in her work, and so her name is Robin Ram, and she.
She's a good writer.
Yeah, she's a really good writer, and she wound up on the cover of the Times Book Review for her memoir Mercy Papers, and she had a really well reviewed. But she worked to this point where it finally all clicked, and I took a story, and literally the next day, one story took another story, and those were her first 2 stories published, and they were at the same time, and she just kept plugging away at it. And if you look at the guy who wrote Tinkers, which won the Pulitzer last week, it was rejected by everybody in town, and he put it in a drawer for 2 years because he just gave up because he was rejected.
See, imagine if he had given up on that text.
Yeah, and it was, he also believed in that text. Even, people were saying it's too slow, it's too interior.
Nothing happens.
Nothing, yeah, and he stuck to his guns and really,
He's dying.
He found the audience for it.
He also, in some ways, he found the right publisher and editor. Because I think, if I remember correctly, what ultimately happened was one editor who read it and decided they weren't going to publish it went to Bellevue Literary Press, and it's a very small press, and said, "I think you guys would like this," and I think it's very good. And they published it, and that's what happened. Anybody else? Yes, over here on the right. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering if the editors can talk specifically about literary nonfiction, both how much you like to publish and who you think is excited right now.
We publish a lot of nonfiction. In fact, when I got there was a rule that we could only publish 3 pieces of fiction per issue. And I asked the publisher, I said, who made up this rule? And she had never heard of it. So I really changed that. But there's lots and lots of really good nonfiction writers. Daniel Alarcon had a piece in our work issue, which was fantastic, about book pirating in Peru. There's a young novelist named Rana Dasgupta who had a piece in our summer issue last year on India. who's, I think, fantastic. It's really rewarding when you sort of help someone discover that they're a nonfiction writer. There's a person that we published in our work issue named Martin Kimani, who's a scholar of war, and is doing a PhD on the Rwandan genocide, and is sort of looking at it rather as almost like a Marxist revolution rather than a sort of tribal conflict. And he wrote a great piece on that for us. I think he's tremendous. Mark Doty has an amazing memoir in our sex issue. I think a lot of times people they do both. There's a great piece in this issue by Brian Chukwueze, who's a Zimbabwean novelist, and to my knowledge, he hasn't written much nonfiction, but he's written an amazing piece about the AIDS epidemic, but he's written about it through the migration of a particular dance which took over Zimbabwe in the 1980s, which was brought back to the country by freedom fighters who had picked it up in other countries, and how the dance became sort of both the virus and the virus carrier, because it brought out this different kind of sexual liberation. I don't know, I could go on all day. I love reading literary nonfiction.
Yeah, same here. I get really excited by people who push the form. One of my favorites is Joanne Beard, and she's done a few pieces for me, but she did one about one of Jack Kevorkian's last patients, and she went around and interviewed everybody who knew this woman, her whole family and Kevorkian's people, and then wrote about her last 2 years of her life from her point of view. So it was a first-person nonfiction, but in the head of someone, and it was great because it sparked a lot of debate outside the magazine and even inside the magazine. There were some editors who just felt that, pushing the envelope a little too hard. But I love people who can, like David Shields, Andrew Monson, people who are doing really interesting things with a form.
It seems to me, as both an editor and a teacher, I'm more and more interested in writers who want to look at that border between fiction and nonfiction,
or even
nonfiction, although, Jorge said everything I write is fiction, even book reviews. Anything processed by memory is fiction. So I feel as if that border is, there is reportage, which is one kind of writing, but when I think of literary nonfiction and lyric essay, I get very excited, and Joanne's work really does thrill me. So she's my neighbor, Mary Gateskill's my neighbor, We have a lot of good things going on up there in Douglas County,
And Carson, too. She has a new book out called Knox, which is part translation of Catalyst, but also it's basically the diary of what happened after her brother died, but also dealing, trying to translate Catalyst at the same time dealing with her brother. And so it's, it's sketches, it's translation.
It's actually an excerpt
in our new issue, we have,
it's a mind-blowing object. The book is
this is actually the Ann Carson panel.
Here. But what we did was facsimiles of her pages, because she has included doodles and artwork and photographs and poetry and commentary on translation.
Yeah, and the book actually folds out. It accordions, and it's just as an object. It's one of the cooler books out there. Nick Flynn, also another great example of someone who mashes poetry and nonfiction and prose in very interesting ways, I think.
No, it's not like the boundary between fiction and nonfiction, but nonfiction and poetry. So with Ann Carson, and also Maggie Nelson is a writer we published a couple issues ago who does that a lot and is quite interesting as well, I think.
And then there's also the boundary between poetry and prose, which is a little blurry these days too, in a very interesting way, enticing way.
But we are out of time. It is 8:30, and I've been instructed to wrap things up punctually. We have copies of PEN America and Granta on sale. We have a subscription discount for PEN America, so I hope you'll stop by the table and take a look. As I said, there are many more World Voices events over the next few days, and you should grab a program or go to pen.org and take a look. But thank you very much for coming. And thank you to the panel.